I mean, how did you guys feel about the second exam? Not good.
No.
I mean, was it easier than the first one? I mean, just compared to the first one. Okay, I see a mixture of reaction. You know, some people say it's not, and some people say it is. Why is it easier? I mean,
Well,
what?
I just ran out of time.
Okay.
My brain is slower. So.
But for people who thought it was easier than the first one, why do you think it was easier? Because there's no pre and post condition? That was pretty much it?
Yes.
Okay, but anyway, your score is online now. If you go to the website, you will see your score. And for our final exam, you know, it is next Friday, the 13th. That's our actual final exam. The time is actually fairly convenient. It is the same time as the class itself, starting at 8 o'clock. But this time it is not until 9:20, which is our usual time frame for the first and second examination. This time it is all the way until 10 o'clock. So it's a little bit longer, not really by much. And we won't have any lectures after that unless you guys really want to talk about it. You know, we can actually come back to this classroom if you want to talk about the final exam. And if you click it, you know, there's nothing here because I haven't got any questions yet for this exam. Okay. Have you guys signed up for classes for the fall or summer?
Just a few more days.
A few more days. Oh, there's nothing left, I can tell you. Have you been keeping an eye on the classes?
No.
No?
I'd rather not be depressed.
Well, it's not really getting depressed. You know, you have to prepare. You know, if you know that a class that you want to sign up for is already, you know, on the wait list, you know, you should plan for alternatives and just, you know, take some other classes that still have spots. But it's getting really bad, you know, and this is not the end of it yet. Spring 2012 is worse because, you know, the department, just the CIS department, has a 10.4% of FTE reduction comparing this semester to spring 2012. So that means, you know, there will be fewer classes. I think we're cutting back one cisp300 class, and I think the C class is going to get cut back as well. Yep.
I was just checking my test score. I think maybe yesterday I checked it in the middle of you grading it.
Uh-huh.
So it said I had like a 9 out of 20. And so it's fixed now, so I was just smiling.
Oh, okay. Smiling. Smiling is good. Yep.
Is there any way for us to like get not necessarily a final grade, but like a grade before a final exam to like, you know, for us to like properly gauge where we're at?
Well, if you turn in all the homework assignment and you
Yeah.
feel fairly sure that the homework assignments, you know, were done correctly, you can basically count on most of those homework assignments getting close to 100%, if not exactly 100%. If you did not turn in something, obviously that would be a different story. For the first exam, it is 20% of your final grade, and then the second exam is 20% of your final grade as well. So when you add up all the numbers, you should add up to somewhere around, you know, for a good student, it will be somewhere around 50-something%. And because the final exam carries 40%. So that would give you an idea of, you know, where you are at right now, and, you know, and then you know the percentage, you know, that you need to get A, B, C, D, F. So that means, you know, you can actually predict how many points, you know, from the final exam you will need to get a certain grade.
Okay.
Yep.
How do we assess what, you haven't graded any of my homework except one, so I have no way to know if what I've turned in as homework is anything you want?
Well, we talked about the solution of all the homework in the class, so you can compare yours to the solution that I have disclosed already.
I follow stuff in class, but I don't know if what I wrote down or put on the papers I turned in meets your needs.
Well, it should match, if not exactly, they should match, you know, very closely, especially in terms of concept. Like return info, you know, is return info, and I need, you know, certain things in that particular field. So even without knowing the score, you should know, you know, how close it is to the proper solution.
Not without feedback.
Not without feedback?
No.
Well, I'll try to grade all of those, before the final exam, so that way you have, the feedback that you need, for the final exam. Any other questions?
Why the 13th? Such a bad day. That's not a good day to put a test on. I'll just put that out there.
The Friday the 13th?
You prove that's a bad day to do anything, so.
And I will try to name the files, 666 dot and so on.
Go ahead and rub more salt into that.
I will actually find out all the unlucky numbers from all different religions and just kind of put it all out there. Just so that people cannot say that I discriminate against certain religions and not others. Okay, here's our practice final exam, and we'll go ahead and do this one just to see what are the solutions to these particular problems. Now remember, these are all sample questions, which means the actual exam will have problems that are similar in terms of format, but not exactly the same in terms of the concepts that will be tested or how they will be tested. So just keep in mind that this is a sample and not the actual thing. So here's the code. This is the code of this particular question. It has two subroutines. It has one swap subroutine and it has one subroutine called pass. In this case, I have types for everything because we have talked about types already in the class. This one is not recursive. You can see that there's no subroutine here that calls itself, but we already know that recursive subroutines are no more. It's not any more difficult than subroutines that has no recursion. We do have swap, and swap is the same as the same swap that we have always talked about. You take two parameters that are passed by reference, and the subroutine will swap or exchange the values of those two parameters. And then we have pass as the other subroutine. This one has a loop inside, and it can potentially call swap depending on the condition, whether a bracket I is greater than a bracket I plus 1 or not. And then we have the actual code outside of the definition of any subroutine, which is just calling pass from the outside of the subroutine. So let's go ahead and track this one down and find out what it does. Yep.
The line 8 and line 19 are the same.
Line 8 and line what?
19.
Why should they not be the same?
It is then define sub twice.
Because I have two subroutines. The subroutine swap and the subroutine pass. Okay, so here we go. Is it still readable to the back, at the back of the classroom?
Yeah.
A little too small? I can only do about this part because I have to leave enough space for the trace. All right, so we start with line 20. And line 20 says we have to invoke the subroutine pass. We are using B, which is my global variable, which is an array also, to specify A, which is our pass by reference parameter in subroutine pass. Because we are not returning any values, it is good to use your return number. If you want to use return info, you can do that too. It's just that it's not going to buy you anything in this case because your return info will still say post to remember that we have to go back to post after this subroutine is done. So you might as well just use return line number for that purpose. Then we have to set up all the things inside the subroutine that we need. We have two things that we have to set up. We have parameter A and also local variable I. Parameter A is a parameter, which means it has to be specified by the invoke statement. In this case, we're passing B to A, So that means A becomes an alias of columns what to what?
C to E.
Column C to column E. Because variable B, which is what I use here to specify parameter A, is my global variable. But B does not occupy just one single column. It is an array, and it occupies 3 columns. And that's why A is an alias of all 3 columns. I is a local variable, which means it starts with an unknown value, and that's why we have a question mark here. Are there any questions about how column F to column H are set up? Questions? Okay. Then we go into the subroutine. The subroutine starts on line 12. And line 12 is just initializing I to 0. So we put a 0 here. Then we move on to line 13. Line 13 is the beginning of a while loop. And you have to figure out whether I is less than bar A bar minus 1 or not. What is bar A bar in this case? Bar A bar is 3 because A is a reference to column C to column E. Column C to column E is an array of integers, and in this case it's an array of 3 integers. Bar A bar is asking how many elements do we have in the array, and in this case we have 3 elements in the array. I is 0. 0 is less than 3 minus 1 is true or false? Has to be true. Then we move on to line 14. Line 14 is the real big question here is A bracket I greater than A bracket I plus 1 or not? Now this is nothing new. Okay, we have seen this already in exam 2. You guys still remember exam 2? It has a question very similar to this one. So what is it? Is it true or false? Well, you find out what is A. A is a reference to column C to column E, and we are accessing the first one in this case because I is 0. So the question really is whether A bracket 0 is greater than A bracket 1. Since A is a reference to B, so we are really asking whether B bracket 0 is greater than B bracket 1. The answer is true. Then we move on to line 15. Line 15 is invoking the swap subroutine. And in this case, now this is the difference between this algorithm and the one that we talked about for exam 2. Because in exam 2, I actually have the swap sequence inside the single subroutine. In this case, we're using another subroutine to actually do the swapping. And to do that, we have to use some additional columns. We're invoking swap, so swap is over here. It does not return a value. That means we can use return line number. There are still a few people in exam 2 that did not use return info when it needs to be return info. But in this case, it doesn't need to be return info because swap does not have a return statement. Any subroutine that has a return statement should use a return info instead of a return line number. So in this case, the line that is logically following line 15 is not line 16. It is actually line 17. Does everybody understand why line 17 is the return line number and not line 16? And it takes 2 parameters and 1 local variable. It has parameter x, which is passed by reference, parameter y, which is passed by reference, and also local variable t, which is just a local variable. All local variables should start with a question mark. X is now specified by A bracket I is 0. And what should I use here? X has to be an alias of some column. Which column should I use here?
C.
It's an alias of column C because A bracket 0 is B bracket 0. B bracket 0 lives in column C. So that's why parameter X is also an alias of column C. And that makes parameter Y an alias of column D. Are there any questions about this step? Setting up columns I, J, K, and L. Any questions about these columns? Okay. And we move on and start on line 5, which is the beginning part, the beginning of the swap subroutine. We want to copy the value of x to t. X is an alias of column C. Column C now has a value of 5, and that's why t ends up with a value of 5. Then we move on to line 6. Line 6 wants to copy the value of y to x. Y is an alias of column D. Column D has a value of 2, and we are copying 2 to x. X is an alias of column C, and that's why column C is the one that is updated to a value of 2. Is that part okay? Okay. Then we move on to line 7. On line 7, we have t equals, or t gets the y gets the value of t. T has a value of 5. Y is an alias of column D, and that's why column D is getting updated with a value of 5. Then we are done with this subroutine. We go to line 8. Line 8 is the end of the subroutine, and that's why we have to take all these columns and indicate that they are now deallocated. I programmed Control S on my keyboard to do strikeout, so that's why I can now do strikeout pretty quickly. If you guys want to know how to do that, I can show you guys how to do that. Does anyone want to know how to do that? Yes? Now, it's only helpful if you're bringing your own OpenOffice to the lab. Okay, so you have to download and install the portable version of OpenOffice. Then you can actually use it. Because it is a feature, or the shortcut keys are associated with the installation. And in the lab, they have their own installation. It is reset every single time the computer is rebooted. So this will only work if you bring your own portable version of OpenOffice. Okay. To do this, you have to go to Tools, and then you go to Customize, and then you go to the Keyboard tab of Customize. So depending on what you want to do, you basically have to look up the category and the function, and then you can go to the shortcut keys to find a key that is not currently used, or you can remap a key to a certain type of function. Let's see, what are the other things that I normally do? Well, let's deal with this one first.
Indenting. Like indenting. What do you do?
Indenting something? Okay, we can do that. But let me show you how to do the strikeout first. The strikeout, it belongs to format, so you have to look at format here. That's basically the name of the menu. In order to access that particular feature, it is under format. Under format, you have to go all the way down to strike through, right here. And now it is associated with Control S. If I want to get rid of the association, I just hit the delete key. So let's say I want to reassociate it with strike through. Then you have to go find a function key that you want to use. You can use any of these function keys as long as it is not currently used. You can use it. So let's just say that I want to use Control S for this purpose. So I just click Control S, and it's not done yet. You have to click Modify to add that function key or to add a keyboard shortcut to this particular function. Is that okay? Now I can do something else. I can do the indentation, which is something that you do not need to do because you are not going to write new code in a spreadsheet, so you don't have to deal with the indentation. So if I want to deal with indentation, it is probably under format as well. And I'm just going to look at increase indent here. Currently has no keys associated with it, and I have to find out what key I want to use to do the indentation. I'll just use Control N for that purpose, and I click Modify, and now Control N is going to do increase indent. If I want to make a decrease indent, I could use Control D. Well, Control D is already done, already used. It's usually good to use some key that is not currently used, just so that you don't reprogram the keyboard in a way that it will conflict with what OpenOffice is supposed to do. When you're all done, you just have to click OK. And now, every time I type Control S, it will do the strike through, and every time I type Control N, it will increase indentation. It might be helpful, it will save you it will shave a few seconds, in your test, every time you want to do the strikeout or strike through. But I think it all adds up. Okay, if you can shave a few seconds here, a few seconds there, that can potentially save you, just enough time, to finish the test. Okay, we're now back to line 17. Line 17 is I gets I plus 1, and this context is gone. Column I to column L are currently not in use. So when I talk about I, there's only one I here, which is column H. Column H is now incremented from 0 to 1. Then we have to go back to the beginning of the loop, which is on line 13. Line 13 is going to reevaluate the condition, and now I know how wide the comments column needs to be. I is less than bar A bar minus 1. Is it still true, or is it false? It is still true because I is 1, bar A bar minus 1 is 2, 1 is less than 2 is true. Then we go to line 14 again. Line 14 is comparing A bracket I, which is now A bracket 1, to A bracket I plus 1, which is A bracket 2. So we have to answer the question, is it true or is it false that A bracket I is greater than A bracket I plus 1? The answer is true, because you have to be careful. We just changed B bracket 1 from 2 to 5. So you have to use the most updated value of a column to compare to the other one. In this case, this is 5, this is 3, and that's why the condition is still true. Are we doing okay? Are we doing okay at this point? Why A bracket I is greater than A bracket I plus 1 is true. Okay. When that condition is true, we have to move on to line 15, and we are invoking swap again. So for the most part, I can just copy and paste from before. Except when you copy and paste, you have to be careful, because we are not we cannot use everything from before. X is now an alias of column D, and Y is now an alias of column E, because I has changed. Okay, local variable I has changed. So A bracket I now refers to column D. A bracket I plus 1, which is A bracket 2, now refers to column E. So you have to be careful about, when you use copy and paste, you just have to be careful not to, remember to go back and change something that needs to be changed. When the columns are all set up, we go into the subroutine swap, and we start with line 5. Line 5 copies the value of X to T. X is an alias of column D. Column D now has a value of 5, so T ends up with a value of 5. Then we move on to line 6. Line 6 copies the value of Y to X. Y is an alias of column E. Column E has a value of 3. We copy that to X. X is an alias of column D, and that's why column D is the one gets changed to 3. And this is line 6. Then we move on to line 7. Line 7 copies the value of T to Y. T has a value of 5 at this point. We copy that to Y. Y is an alias of column E, so now column E is updated to a value of 5. Are there any questions so far? The invocation of swap is pretty much just like the previous time, except we are dealing with column D and column E this time instead of column C and column D. Then we are at column 8. Line 8. For line 8, I can just copy the whole row because it is exactly the same as last time. And then now we can move on to line 17, because return line number tells me to go back to line 17. Line 17 wants to add 1 to I. I is now 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. And after that, we go back to the beginning of the loop. The beginning of the loop wants to reevaluate the condition on line 13, which is I is less than bar A bar minus 1. It is I is 2, bar A bar minus 1 is 2 as well. 2 is less than 2 is false. So now we get out of the loop. So when we are out of the loop, we go to line 19. Line 19 is the end of the subroutine. The first thing we do is we look up return line number to remind ourselves that we have to go to post next. Then we deallocate the 3 columns that we allocated for this invocation and do the strike through, and we are done with this particular algorithm.
So this is supposed to be arranging the numbers from increasing order.
Not exactly. It is supposed to push the largest value to the end of the to the end of the array.
Okay.
If you want to sort an array, you just keep doing this a few passes, and the array will become sorted.
Okay.
Because each time you invoke pass, it will push the largest value to its rightful place. So if you keep doing this, if you have, let's say, 5 elements in an array, then if you call pass 5 times, it is guaranteed, or if you call it 4 times, it is guaranteed to have to sort the array. This is also called bubble sort, because it's like bubbling up,
Yeah.
It is also a very slow sorting algorithm, so you should not use. It's easy to understand, easy to visualize, but it's not very efficient. So let's go ahead and save this again, and then we can move on to the next question. All the questions look like this, because they all have a trace except for the pre and post condition one. This is question number 2. And it's over here. Let's take a look at the code first, then we'll go ahead and trace it. This one is not very long either, but it does use the concept of records, which is something that we did not talk about, or it was not in exam 2. So this is the first time we see a question that has the concept of a record. In this case, this record is defined to have a member called V and a member called N. They are both integers. When you look at the subroutine look, it takes on one parameter, that is A, and it's an array of N. So that means we have an array where each element in the array is a record, and each record has 2 elements. When we take a look at sheet 2 later, we'll see exactly how the columns are used for something like that. And then we have a loop basically, but in this case you can see that in the loop, I is not getting just I plus 1. We use a particular member of an element of the array to update I. So that's kind of the tricky part of this particular question. And outside of the subroutine, we have one single statement to invoke look. We use global variable B to specify parameter A. So this is the code. And let's take a look at the trace window. This is the trace window. And I'm just going to take a look at B first, because we want to understand exactly how B is organized. B is an array of N, or record N. So you can see that B takes up column C all the way to column H. It takes up exactly 6 columns. Each element, element 0, element 1, and element 2, each element is a record N, and that's why each element has a member V, also has a member N. And that's why the array itself, which has 3 elements only, is taking up 6 columns. Do we have any questions about the structure of global variable B, which is an array of record N? No problem? This is all good? Okay. So this is our precondition. And the way I'm going to do this is I will shrink this window and just kind of put it here, because we need to keep an eye on this all the time when we trace the algorithm. And we'll open a new window for the trace itself. This gets a little bit tricky in terms of the placement of the windows. So this way we don't need to display this portion all the time. And that will save us a little bit of time. It will save a little bit of screen space. So I use a separator bar to separate it here and scroll it over, so that this window, window 3, only needs to deal with the tracking of the execution, and we can use the other 2 windows, one to show us the actual code and one to show us the array, so this way we can just see everything more easily. The precondition is already done. There's nothing else to say about the precondition, so we move on to line 13. Oh, I forgot to save it first. go. So now we start with line 13. Line 13 is over here. It is just the invocation of look. Does look contain any return statements? Nope, it does not contain any return statements. So that means return line number is fine. Now if you want to, you can actually use return info as well. It's just that in this case, the return info is just going to be post as well. In other words, return info is more general than return line number because you can always use return info to tell you to go to the next line to execute. But since our convention is to use return line number, I'm just going to stick with that convention. And the next thing we have to do is to set up all the columns that look needs. I forgot one thing here. I forgot to indicate that I is a local variable. So let me just fix that portion here. Okay, I don't really need a line number for this one, so I don't need to change the line numbers of the rest. I don't need a line number for this one because it is not executed, so it doesn't really need a line number. I have array A as a parameter. Now I have I as a local variable. As a local variable, I starts with an unknown value. What about A? What should I write down here? C to H, exactly. Because we are using B to specify A, down here, and B occupies column C to column H. So A becomes an alias of exactly the same thing is an alias of column C to column H. Now I have a separate question to ask you guys. Why can I look at A as an array of 6 integers? Because if I look at these columns here, it looks like it is an array of 6 integers. Can I look at it that way? The answer is no, I cannot. Okay, but why can't I look at column C to column H as an array of 6 integers? What forces me to look at this as an array of 3 record ends?
Because there's elements which you can access it.
Right, and also because the type is indicated here. If you look at line 6 of the pseudocode, it restricts how I can look at these columns. Okay, it restricts me to look at array A only as an array of record ends and not anything else. Is that okay so far? Because this is the whole idea, this is the whole purpose of why we have types. Why do we need to indicate what a particular parameter or a local variable is, so that we only have one way to interpret the columns? Because without this restriction here, I could interpret the 6 columns in different ways. But with this, I can now only interpret those columns in a single way, which is an array of 3 record n. Now with that done, we can move on and move into the subroutine, starting on line 7. I gets a value of 0. Then we move on to line 8. While I is greater than or equal to 0 and I is less than bar a bar. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Is I greater than or equal to 0? It is. Since this is a conjunction, can I just use a short-circuited evaluation and stop here? I cannot, because with a conjunction, even if one side is true, the whole thing may or may not be true. It depends on what the other side is. So this makes me, evaluate the other side of the conjunction. I is less than bar a bar. What is bar a bar?
3.
Bar a bar is 3. Why is it not 6?
Because it's 3 elements.
Because it has 3 elements. Exactly. Very good. When we use bar a bar, we are not counting the number of columns. We are counting the number of elements. Okay. In other words, how many things are there that can use the square bracket notation? In this case, we have exactly 3, and that's why bar a bar. And since A is a reference to column C to column H, that's why bar a bar is 3. I is 0. 0 is less than 3 is true. True and true is true. So we are done with this condition here. The condition being true means that we have to get into the loop. So we go to line 9. Line 9 is going to print something. The question is, what is it printing? Well, let's work on this one step at a time. We start with A. What is A? A is an alias of column C to column H. But we are restricted to only look at column C to column H as an array of n. Okay? So that means, can I do the square bracket after A? It's an array. If it is an array, I can do the indexing operator using the square brackets. I has a value of 0 at this point, so I'm just basically accessing A bracket 0, which is the first element of those arrays. The first element is right here, so we are looking at column C and column D. I cannot print both columns at the same time. I can only print one column at a time. Which column am I printing? Which one is the member V of this particular element? It's column C, so that means it's printing a value of 5. Are there any questions about the trace of line 9 of this algorithm? This is okay? Okay. Now we move on to line 10. Line 10 is actually not any more difficult than line 9. It's just that we are using a different member for a different purpose. Okay, A is still an alias to column C to column H, which is an array of 3 n's in this case. We are using the square bracket notation to indicate which one we want to access. I has not changed, it is still 0, so we are still accessing the first element in the array, which is from column C to column D. Except this time we want member n of that record instead of member V of the record. Member n of that record has a value of 2. So this means the entire right-hand side here evaluates to a value of 2. We are using the 2 to update our local variable our local variable I. So I now gets updated to a value of 2. Are there any questions about line 10 of the trace, which also coincides with line 10 of the algorithm? Is that part okay? You just have to do it one step at a time. What is A? A is an array. With an array, we can do indexing. But after we do the indexing, we get to a particular element. What can we do with each element of array A? Well, each one is a record n, which means we can access each individual member of that record. It has a member called V. It has a member called n. We just have to find out which one we are trying to access. Any questions about this part? If there are no questions, we'll move on. After line 10, where do we go? We have to go back to the top. We have to go back to line 8. I think one student, there was one answer in exam 2 that treated a loop like a conditional statement. That would be incorrect, because a loop always goes back to the beginning, and the only way you can get out of a loop is when line 8 is, when the condition of line 8 evaluates to false. So it's just a reminder for people, in the final exam, make sure that you treat a loop like a loop is and not as a conditional statement. We're back to line 8. I now has a value of 2. Is 2 greater than or equal to 0? Sure. And is 2 less than 3? Yes. So true and true is true. We have to go to line 9 again. Except this time I has a value of 2. So when you go to line 9, this is basically print A bracket 2 dot V. But A is an alias of the same array that B is. So we are talking about B bracket 2 dot V here. B bracket 2 dot V has a value of -1. And that's what we are printing to the screen. Print -1. And then on line 10, we are accessing the other member. We are accessing member n in this case. And member n of exactly the same element has a value of 1. And we use that to update I. I now has a value of 1. Are there any questions about row 13 of the trace? No questions? This is all working out? Okay. Then we have to go back to the beginning again on line 8. and we have to reevaluate. Is 1 greater than or equal to 0? True. Is 1 less than 3? True. True and true is true. So we have to go to line 9 again. So without actually explaining everything, what are we printing this time? Hmm? 0. That's right. We are printing 0 because we are printing member V of of element 1 of this entire array, and that turns out to have a value of 0. And on line 10, how are we updating the value of I? Negative 1. So now when we go back to line 8, we can evaluate the first part of the conjunction. Is negative 1 greater than or equal to 0? Nope. If that one is false, I don't even bother with the second condition because of short-circuited evaluation. But since the whole thing is false, we have to get out of the loop. When we get out of the loop, we get to line 12 right away. Line 12 is the end of the subroutine. First thing to do is to look up the return line number to remind us where to go. And then we have to deallocate those particular columns. And we're done. Are there any questions about Q2? Yep.
Is it important for us to use short-circuit evaluation like on our next exam with that coming up, or is it okay to write out the entire?
I probably won't take any points off if you write out the entire thing. However, it is important for you to understand that conjunctions and disjunctions, they are always evaluated using a short-circuited evaluation method, because it does impact your program sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. Because how about this? Okay, you have to keep that in mind because it can change the behavior of the program. I can give you one example. Shall I come back and talk about this later, or do you want me to go over this right now? Because we are right at this topic, so I think we should probably just use an example to illustrate this first. Okay. Sorry? Yeah, let's do it now. But are there any other questions about this one? Because I want to finish Q2 first before we move on and talk about that specific issue. Q2 is okay? Can I close it?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm closing Q2. It is already saved, and I think the screen recording is still working. On Monday, I was teaching VBA, and I was doing the same thing, recording the class, except I was using my own laptop computer, and halfway through the class, I ran out of disk space. So I only got like half of the class recorded. I had to go home and actually re-record something, using my headset at home, which was not nearly as much fun because I have to talk to myself, basically I was just talking to the screen and recording the whole thing at the same time. All right, let's close this one, and I'll give you one example where short-circuit evaluation makes a big difference in terms of the execution of the program. So let's do it. Spreadsheet. Okay. So in this case, I'll define sub. I don't know exactly how to call this. Okay, I'll just call it cap. Okay. And it's going to take one parameter passed by reference. So I is a reference to an integer, and it will pass by value another parameter called L. I use uppercase L here so that it is easy to differentiate between the I and the L. And the subroutine is going to do something like this. It's going to say if I is less than L, then what it will do is it will say I gets I plus 1 and return false. Else it will return true, and if, and define sub. So now with my new keyboard shortcut, I can do the indentation by pressing Control N. But I still have to do this part here, because I can do that. Okay. Let's take a look at subroutine cap first. Okay. Subroutine cap is kind of strange because we don't see this kind of subroutine too often. It has return statements. Okay? In other words, the subroutine can go anywhere a true or a false value can go. Okay? That's one thing about a subroutine that returns a value is it can be placed inside anything that can, in this case, expect a Boolean value. But at the same time, it also takes parameter I, which is passed by reference, and change that thing. So this is a weird combination. It is certainly not common, but it is done, nonetheless. Not all the time, but there are subroutines written this way. Now, this subroutine by itself is not really too suspicious. We kind of know what it does, but it is the combination of this subroutine and something else that makes the short-circuited evaluation very important. Is it short-circuiting or not? That becomes a big question. So outside of this, I would just try to make this short. So I will say I have a global variable. Let me just say that I have a global variable called x, and x starts with a value of 5. Okay? And here I have a conditional statement. The conditional statement is saying, if x is less than 5, and invoke cap using x to specify I, and let's say 10 to specify L. Then we go ahead and print. We just invoked cap. That's my entire program. Okay, it's not a very useful program. The only purpose of this program is to illustrate, this whole concept of short-circuited evaluation being, impacting the outcome of the program in a very significant way. So let's go ahead and see how this program is going to be traced. This will make a good question for the final exam. Or something similar. All right, so we definitely need comments here. In fact, the comments probably is going to be a fairly long one. We'll adjust the width of that when we need to. And we have a global variable x here because I just don't want to make a stub subroutine just for that. Okay. The precondition is we don't know anything about x. We don't need to know anything about x because line 11 is going to initialize it. And after that, we go to line 11, which initializes x to 5. Nothing really suspicious here. So now we are at line 12. Okay. On line 12, what are we going to do? Well, we have to evaluate the condition of the conditional statement to see whether it is true or not. Now, you can see that the condition, which is, x is less than 5 and blah, 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 it has an invocation of a subroutine. But if you use short-circuited evaluation, what are you going to do? All you have to do is to say x is less than 5 is false, and you go to post, and you're all done. Okay? Now, on the other hand, what about, what if the condition, what if you're not doing short-circuited evaluation? Then you would have invoked the subroutine, and the invocation of the subroutine in this case is not changing the result of the conjunction, because anytime you have false and something, it is always false. But the side effect of the subroutine is changing the value of I. It's changing the value of x. So that's why in this case, whether you're using short-circuited evaluation or not makes a big difference. Because in one case, when you are using short-circuited evaluation, the value of x does not change. But on the other hand, if you do not use short-circuited evaluation, it does not change the outcome of the conjunction, but it will change the value of x. Is that okay? Does everybody understand why, in this case, it makes a big difference whether we are using short-circuited evaluation or not? And that's why, I think it is important to write down, when you evaluate, conjunctions and disjunctions. That's why I think it is useful to only evaluate up to the point where you can determine the outcome of the whole thing and no further than that. Does everybody understand the point of this particular sample program? Yes? Okay. So let me save this one, because this is, as I said, this is good material for the final exam. So I get the best ideas of of exam questions from students, because there are 20-something of you and there's only one of me. You guys can think of better ideas than I can. I did the same thing in my assembly programming class yesterday, and they did not like it. Someone mentioned something about some tricky case, and I said, oh, this is a good kind of question to ask in the final. And they said, no, next time don't do anything, don't say anything to Ted.
So I take it you decided not to do a multiple choice final, right?
Well, I really thought about using multiple choice because that would make my job a whole lot easier. But I felt it's not a good assessment tool if I use multiple choice, because one, you either get the point or not, which is worse than these open-ended questions. With open-ended questions, depending on what I'm really looking for, you can sometimes get partial credit when you don't have enough time to finish the whole thing, or you make some mistake and you did not actually get the final result. But with a multiple choice question, there's no such thing. I mean, the answer is the answer. I also do not like asking questions out of context. In other words, I don't like to ask questions like out of these possible operations, which one applies to an array? And I'll give you these operators like the indexing operator, the bar operator, the addition operator, the conjunction and whatnot, because that's really taking everything out of context and just asking one simple thing. It's basically asking okay, when you look at a hammer, which end is heavier, the handle or the or the head of the hammer, which side is heavier? Well, I mean, you can answer that question, which shows that you know something about a hammer. But do you know how to use a hammer correctly to hit a nail? Well, I want to know whether you can hit a nail. I don't want you to tell me that the head of a hammer is heavier than the handle. So I think I'm keeping the format, which makes it it's lengthy to grade exams, this way. But I think it is a better way to to do it. Which also brings up a question. Which brings up something else. When you look at the previous exam, let me just take a look at the previous exam first, because I want to show you guys, how I graded, how I assigned the points. I did not actually write down, tons of, writing to tell people why they get the point values that they get. Instead, I use a color coding system this time. So let me go back to exam 2 and take a look at. I cannot show results because if I show results, then you guys will see each other's stuff. And I can preview. Nope, edit. So what I did was something like this. When you look at the feedback, each one of you will see something like this, which is the solution. But the solution is color coded. In this case, each color represents a point. If you get this part, and this part right, that's 1 point. If you get this part, and this part right, that's 1 point. If you get, this part, and this part, and this part right, that's 1 point. If you get it partially right, then it depends on how many of these things you get correct. That determines the partial point value of that particular point. These three add up to 1 point as well. And let's say someone did the first one and ran out of time. That means that person will get 1/3 of a point. So for the second exam, this is how I did the grading. Except the second exam is fine. There's no pre and post conditions, so it's all color coded like this. There's one that only has like 4 different colors. So for that one, that means if the overall algorithm is correct, then you get the last point. Is that okay? I mean, does everybody understand how the point values are associated with your score? And that's why partial credit are easier with an open-ended question like this. If it is just multiple choice, or if I ask you for the final answer, like what is the value, what value is printed at the end of the execution of this program, then you give me a number. If that number is wrong, and that's only because you did one little step incorrectly, you get no point values for that exam. for that question. So I think that is actually unfair to to you guys, because you can have it 80% correct and only the last step done incorrectly, and then you get no point value out of doing everything else. And where was I? We are ready to move on to question number 3?
Yes.
Okay. So here's question number 3. Basically the same format. And none of these traces you can see is lengthy. I'm not trying to make things lengthy and it will take a long time to do it. It's just testing the concepts. Each one tests kind of a different combination of concepts. So let's take a look at this one. This one is recursive, and this one does not use any concept that we introduced from the second exam to the final exam. We only actually added records during that time frame and types. So this one does use integer as a type, but that part is not tricky at all in this case. So let's take a look at this one, and we'll trace this and probably take a break after this. Forgot to save the file first. Okay, so we start with comments, line number. We don't have any global variables. There's a reason why I call this subroutine div for divide, because that's what it does. It divides x by y, and it returns the quotient. Let's find out how it does it. It's a very cumbersome way to do division, but it gets the job done. We start with line 10 because line 10 is, well, we start with preconditions. There's nothing to say because we don't have any global variables. Then we go to line 10. Line 10 is a print statement, but I cannot really do anything about the printing part until I'm done with the invocation of div. So that's why I need to invoke div. When I invoke div, I have to be careful because it does return values. So that means we cannot use return line number. We have to use return info in this case. In the second exam, quite a number of people use, when they use return info, they do not put the right information inside this cell for return info. Some people just write down, okay, let me just tell you what is expected and what you need to put inside the return info cell. You need to write down which line we are dealing with. When the subroutine is done, which line are we going back to? Then you have to write the rest of that line, everything on that line except for the invocation itself, which should be replaced by a question mark. That is what I'm expecting from the answer. Some people did not write the line 10 here, just wrote print question mark. That is not sufficient because print question mark does not tell me where I'm supposed to go back to. In this program, it's okay because there's only one line that has a print. But what if I have a program that has multiple print statements? Then I have no idea which line I'm supposed to go back to. So that's why it needs to have all these components. It needs to have a line number. It needs to repeat the content on that line, with the exception of the subroutine that is being invoked right now, which should be replaced by a question mark. Okay. Then we have to specify the parameters and local variables, if any. In this case, we don't have any local variables, but we do have two parameters, x and y. And you have to specify what goes into x and what goes into y. According to this invocation, 54 goes to x. So x starts with a value of 54, and y starts with a value of 20. That. And we are now done with the columns. We can now move in and talk about the subroutine itself, starting on line 4. This one is not really difficult, because everything is fairly straightforward. X is greater than or equal to y is true because 54 is greater than or equal to 20. Then we move on to line 5. Line 5 is a return statement, but I don't know what I'm supposed to return until I am done with invoking div again. So this way, this time we have to do the whole thing again. We have to set up return info, x and y, because we're invoking div again. The return info, the same thing. Where am I supposed to come back to? Where am I supposed to go back to when div is done? I'm supposed to go back to line 5 and continue with the return statement. What else do I need to do when I come back to line 5? Well, there's the return. The invocation is replaced by a question mark, and don't forget the +1 at the end. I don't think too many people made the mistake of forgetting the +1, because the previous exam has a question that has a invoke something +1, and most people got it right. A few people did it wrong in one way or another, but most people who did it correctly, and remembered to have a +1 at the end. What am I passing to this x here? What do you think? X minus y specifies x. So what do you think goes here? 34. Because the left-hand side of the right arrow refers to variables that are already defined in the current invocation. X has a value of 54, y has a value of 20. 54 minus 20 is 34. Y is passed to y, so that means it's just 20. Are there any questions about column F to column H? Questions? Moving on to line 4. Line 4 is still asking, is x greater than or equal to y? X is greater than or equal to y is true. So we'll do the same thing here. Then we move to line 5 again. Line 5 is going to invoke the subroutine again. So this time I'll just be a little bit lazy and copy and paste. But every time I copy and paste, I have to be extra careful and make sure that I make all the necessary changes to values that have changed already. In this case, this is now 14 because 34 minus 20 is 14. And now I'm done with the initialization of the columns. Then we can move into the subroutine and start with line 4. Line 4 is comparing x to y. X is greater than y. X is greater than or equal to y is false. So that means I cannot go to line 5. This time I have to go to line 7. Here's line 7. Line 7 is a very easy return statement. We are just returning a value of 0. So now the question is, what am I doing when I return 0? What do I need to do? I look up the return info cell. I copy and paste the content of the return info cell, and I change the question mark to the value that I'm returning, which in this case is 0. That's all that I do. Okay, I don't do anything else. I do not even simplify 0 plus 1 is 1. All I'm doing is replacing the question mark with an exact value. Okay, so I'm now done with line 7. After line 7, we go to the end of the subroutine on line 9. When we're at the end of the subroutine, there are two things to do. One is to look up return info so that we know which line we're supposed to go back to. In this case, we're supposed to go back to line 5. But line 5 is now like this and not like this anymore. The second thing we have to do is to deallocate all the columns that we have allocated for this invocation. And now we are ready to go back to line 5. But line 5 looks like this now. Can I actually go ahead and return, or do I have anything else to do on that line? I can go ahead and return in this case. And what value am I returning?
1.
I'm returning 1. If I'm returning 1, that means I am just going to my return info cell, copy and paste it, change the question mark to a 1, and I'm done. I do not do any simplifications. I know you guys can all see 1 plus 1 is 2 here, but we don't evaluate the 1 plus 1 at this point. This is the wrong time to evaluate that. After line 5, we get out of the conditional statement. We go to line 9 again. On line 9, we do the same thing as before. We look up the return info cell. It reminds us to go back to line 5. And then we can deallocate the columns that we allocated for this invocation. And now we are back to line 5. But line 5 now looks like this instead of looking like this. And now we know exactly what we are supposed to return, because 1 plus 1 is 2, we are returning 2. So that means when we go back to line 5, we copy and paste this. Now this is the other thing that some people did in exam 2. Some people wrote down something to the effect of this, okay? Because the return statement says that we are returning 1 plus 1, so we are just going to put 1 plus 1 here to replace the question mark. That is also incorrect. I did not take a lot of points off, okay, for that particular question, which was using a Boolean as a return value. I only took off 1 point, when people do it like this. But if the rest of the program is still correct, those people get 4 points out of 5. So this is not right, because by the time you replace the question mark, the content of the question mark itself has to be a single value. It cannot be an expression like this. So that means it has to be a 2 when you replace the question mark. Is that okay? Does everybody understand when you're supposed to evaluate and when you're not supposed to evaluate? Okay. After this, after line 5, we move on to line 9. Line 9 is the end of the subroutine. We do exactly the same thing, except this time it tells us to go back to line 10 instead of line 5, and then we can deallocate the columns like that. Now we're back to line 10. But line 10 now looks like this. We can definitely print a value of 2, and then we are all done. Post. Are there any questions about this particular trace? No questions? So let me save the file. And, well, that's a good reminder that we need to take a break. So let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at 9:20.
I have to work in a little bit. So the next exam is Friday 8 a.m. or is it a different time?